so incompetent or so uncaring. We also see that using the Israelites to do this ugly job would be exceedingly bad for their moral and spiritual development. Murphy brushes off this charge, denying that there's any evidence of psychological damage to the Israelites in the texts. That may be so, but when I say that commanding the Israelites to slaughter the inhabitants of Jericho was bad for them, I do not necessarily mean that it made them worse than they already were. What I do mean is that divinely mandated genocide would have made it more difficult for them to learn that all persons are worthy of respect and consideration. It is obvious that the genocide texts were written by people who saw nothing wrong with killing non-combatants in warfare, since there is no moral tension in the stories they tell. If the Battle of Jericho really did take place as described, the victorious army was no doubt already quite used to killing women and children. That in itself is troubling. After receiving the law, and after decades of special training in the wilderness, the people of God should not be operating on such a low moral level, unless, of course, the law and the training left out vitally important information about how persons should be treated. I turn next to the question whether God wronged the Jerichoites. Murphy argues that he could not have, since he and they were not subject to a common set of moral requirements. Here's a capsule summary of Murphy's argument. In order for persons to share a dikaiological order, two things must be true. First, they must be subject to normative rules having a common source. Second, it must be possible for nearly everyone in the moral community to understand the norms by which they are all bound. Except in special circumstances, neither condition is satisfied by God in relation to human beings. The first is not satisfied because God is sovereign and cannot be subject to any external source of moral obligation. The second is not satisfied because, quote, any norms of justice in which God is naturally linked to created rational beings would be limited to what the dimmest kind of rational being can characteristically grasp, and because it is perverse to suppose that God could be subject to such limits. Only if God chooses to cooperate with us can it be possible for him to wrong anyone. When the walls of Jericho fell, God had entered into a covenant with the Israelites and was actively cooperating with them. But God had entered into no such covenant with the Jerichoites and was not cooperating with them. Under the circumstances that obtained at that time, it was therefore possible for God to wrong the Israelites, but impossible for him to wrong the Jerichoites. So, does this mean that if today God commanded the faithful with whom he is cooperating to slaughter men, women, and children with whom he is not cooperating, he would not be wronging the latter? Apparently not. Murphy tells us that when God became a human being, he entered the dikaiological order once and for all. In this way, the slaughter of the Jerichoites is tucked safely into the pre-Christian past and sets no dangerous precedents for us. Let's pause for a moment to note how difficult it is to square these claims with the biblical record. Isn't God supposed to have been cooperating with human beings long before there were any Israelites? We're all, in some sense, however figurative, the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, and God entered into important relationships with them and all their children. He cared for Adam and Eve and held them responsible for their disobedience. He found Abel's sacrifice acceptable and held Cain responsible for killing his brother. He put a mark on Cain's forehead to warn others not to kill him. He made an important promise to Noah after the great flood. He walked and talked with Abraham, who, it must not be forgotten, had two sons, one of whose descendants were not Israelites. God spoke to the mother of that other son and promised that her son too would be the father of a great nation. All of this long predates the Jerichoites. Interaction and cooperation and promise-giving are present in these stories. So why, on Murphy's account, is this not sufficient to bring God into the human dikaiological order? Let's return to Murphy's argument for saying that God is not by nature so positioned as to be capable of wronging the Jerichoites. One of his principal reasons for taking this line is that God does not by nature satisfy the source constraint for participation in our dikaiological order. Why not? Murphy's answer seems to hinge on the requirements of divine sovereignty. God would not be God if he were subject to an external standard of justice. To this I reply, God would not be God if he were not supremely just in all his dealings with creatures made in his image. But that can be so only if there are moral standards that he fully and completely satisfies. You may fold these standards into God's nature if you don't think they should be external to God. But the fact remains that if God creates a living, breathing, self-conscious, free agent, he creates something possessing a certain dignity, someone who deserves respect and who is therefore capable of being wronged by him. If God has children created in his own image, he does not have to cooperate with them in order to make it wrong for him to abuse them. Failure to cooperate would itself be a form of abuse. Does this compromise God's sovereignty in some way that should trouble theists? No more, I think, than the fact that God does not get to decide whether 2 and 2 make 4. What of Murphy's claim that if God were subject to our norms of justice, he would be subject to norms that are limited in their complexity to what the dimmest kind of rational being can characteristically grasp? I do not feel the force of this consideration. God knows more than we about everything. No doubt that goes for the nature of justice as much as for anything else, but it doesn't follow that we know nothing about justice or that none of what we do know is applicable to God. Indeed, I would say that the most fundamental principles of justice set minimum conditions that God must satisfy in order to be a just ruler. To appreciate this point, it may help to do a small thought experiment. Imagine a distant planet on which God has created 2 species of non-humans who are free, self-conscious, and rational. Call them the alphas and the betas. God chooses the alphas as his own, and at one point in their history, he becomes incarnate as an alpha. But God cooperates with the betas in no way. Occasionally, however, he orders the alphas to wage an extermination campaign against a city inhabited by betas. He tells the alphas that he does this to provide Lebensraum for them. The alphas are duly grateful. I do not have an analysis of wronging that I'm prepared to defend, but it does seem to me that whatever analysis we adopt, it must accommodate our bedrock moral intuitions. Mine tell me that in this little story, the betas are victims. As far as I can see, Murphy is unable to accommodate this intuition. I turn next to Murphy's suggestion about the way in which God can and does bind himself to us by entering our dikaiological order. When, as was the case with ancient Israel, God cooperates with a people, Murphy says that he subjects himself to justice norms. In this case, and only in this case, can we speak coherently of God's wronging anyone. But as Murphy himself notes, many questions remain unanswered. What exactly is involved in such cooperation? Which norms of justice does God place himself under when he cooperates with us? Could God cease cooperating and thereby escape from our dikaiological order? Murphy says he has no settled view about these matters, but that such questions have now been made simply academic by the incarnation. This is much too quick for me. Even today, there are isolated tribes that know nothing of the Christian gospel. God has not, to borrow an analogy from Murphy, gotten down on the floor and played with them. So then, would God be wronging them if he commanded us to exterminate them and take their land? In one sense, this question is purely academic. No Christian nowadays would take seriously the possibility of such a divine command, but we need to know why we should not take this possibility seriously. Without answers to the above-mentioned questions about the nature of divine cooperation and its relation to justice norms, I do not see how Murphy can say whether God would be wronging those tribes if he issued such a command. The same goes for the Jerichoites. The details really do matter. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that God cannot be faulted for wronging the Jerichoites. At this point, Murphy imagines his critic asking, don't our standards of justice require solidarity with them over and against this alarming being who is so awesome but seems nevertheless so uncivilized? Murphy responds by asserting that God loves all of us and that this makes all the difference. God may sometimes do strange and terrible things that we can't understand, but that is a familiar enough phenomenon. Our children don't always understand what we're up to. Even so, they should trust us because they have plenty of evidence of our love. I fail to see how this speaks to the condition of the Jerichoites. They are God's children too, created in his image and after his likeness. They have acquired a lot of false beliefs and odious religious practices. They know nothing of Yahweh save that he is the God of a fierce tribe that wants to kill them and take their land. What evidence of Yahweh's love do they have? What evidence, for that matter, do we have that God cared for them? If there is a story in which God shows his love for the Jerichoites, it is not to be found in the Hebrew Bible. How then can our hearts not go out to them in sympathy? How can we not side with them against this alarming and uncivilized God?